Welcome to Season 2 of the Erotic Realm podcast, where we explore the world of eroticism, one erotic realm at a time. I'm Em, a sexologist and kinkster. The mission of the Erotic Realm is to humanize desire in all of its forms, including darker desires. Each episode, we dive deep into the psychology of desire with a sexpert, everyday kinkster, or a kink expert. This is an independent podcast. To support it, please consider becoming a paid subscriber at psychologyofdesire.com, where you'll also find deep dives into desire and surveys that you can participate in. You can also sign up there to get the podcast delivered directly to your inbox when it's released. And now for today's episode.
The following episode explores sexual education, censorship, and what it takes to create a world where people can actually have more satisfying sex lives. I'm joined by Dr. Mark Schoen, sex educator, filmmaker, and founder of SexSmartFilms. His work has spanned decades of sexual health education, from New York classrooms in the 1970s to building one of the most important archives of sex education films in the world. We talk about what first drew him to human sexuality, what he learned from working in schools at a time when sex education was still deeply controversial and arguably still is, and why film became such a powerful medium for reducing shame and increasing understanding. We also explore censorship, banned books, and the responsibility of media in shaping sexual attitudes, and what Mark learned from icons such as William Masters, Betty Dodson, and the one and only Dr. Ruth. This is a conversation about sexual freedom, cultural change, and why honest sex education is still one of the most radical tools that we have. Enjoy. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Erotic Realm. Today we're exploring the Erotic Realm with Dr. Mark Schoen, sex educator, filmmaker, and founder of SexSmartFilms. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. It's
Happy
a
to
pleasure
have
to
you.
be here.
Yep, pleasure to have you here. So let's start at the beginning. What first drew you toward studying human sexuality and being involved in this field in the 70s?
Well, if you would have told me that I was going to be a sex educator when I was very young, even in college, I would have said you're out of your mind. I became a health educator. And the second year I was teaching in New York State mandated that we teach about sexually transmitted infections. I'm teaching 7th grade, which are 12-year-olds. And the first day I wrote the names of the diseases on the board. And I said, you get these diseases through sexual contact. Hands went up. What does that mean? I said, it means either oral genital contact or sexual intercourse. What does that mean? I spent the whole first class explaining what I meant by sexual contact. The class ends. I walk out into the hallway, and the principal of the school is waiting for me because he knew it was the first day of this class. And he said, how did it go? And I said, if I were a parent, I wouldn't be happy. He said, why not? And I told him the story I just told you. And he said, I said, I'm teaching them about sexuality by way of disease. Can you think of a more negative approach? And he said, good point. What do you think we should do about it? And there was a moment of silence, and I said, maybe we should start a sex education program. And he said, let's go for it. I had no training in this area, so I did some research, and New York University had a graduate program in human sexuality, and that summer you could go take 12 credits in Sweden. I did that. It changed my life. I started a sex education program, and I went on and continued at NYU. and actually got a PhD from their human sexuality program. And filmmaking was a hobby. I made little films to use when I was teaching. And one of my professors at NYU saw some of my little films and he encouraged me to do more, and we collaborated on some. And we started making films. And eventually I left my teaching job to do films full time. So that's basically how I got started.
Okay, so you mentioned that you did a PhD in sexuality. Was that a film project? What was the
No,
topic of your
the
PhD?
I looked at two antecedent factors to viewing sexually explicit films, and they were attitudes and experience. And I found, to make a long story short, that people who had the most negative attitudes about sexuality and people who had the least sexual experience had the most negative reactions when they saw films that were sexually explicit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so did you propose that there needed to be more education around that to
Yeah,
allow more positive attitudes? Mm-hmm.
absolutely. And I wrote a children's book. One of the things that I thought was a problem is Americans don't get any sex education. And if you ask an American, what were the names you used for your genitals when you were a child? And if you ask 10 different people, you'd get 10 different euphemisms. And having spent some time in Sweden, I saw in Sweden, sex education is on the national curriculum. So children, when they're 5 years old, they start learning about sexuality in school and learn the correct names for genitals. So I wrote a children's book called Belly Buttons Are Navels that was released in 1990, and it's still available on Amazon in soft cover. It came out as hardcover originally. And basically, it's teaching children the names of every body part from head to toe, including the penis, the vulva, the clitoris, the testicles, and they're just another body part. And when the book, I made a film with the book where a grandmother's reading the book to two young children, and there's discussion about it. And the film has the same titles, and it's available on SexSmartFilms.com. But the controversy that it caused was, people had, you're going to teach children the names of their genitals? I said, and I remember saying to someone, I pointed at their eyes. I said, what did you call these when your children asked what they were? I said, did you call them CCs? They said, no, we call them eyes. I said, right. There's no stigma with any other part of the body. So this book came out in 1990. It was in libraries. And so in 2024, they started being withdrawn from libraries. And the Kinsey Institute has a collection of copies of the books that have been withdrawn. And they had me there, and some of them are stamped with big red letters that say withdrawn, and they're from public libraries. And it's just fascinating that this is becoming a banned book.
How does that feel? Because you've been a sex educator since the 70s. So that's 55 years.
Yes.
And now you're experiencing a time when a book that you wrote in the 90s has been banned. How does that feel as a sex educator?
It feels like we're going backwards in time. The politics is interfering with the science and education.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And it's very disturbing, to tell you the truth.
And you mentioned that the children in Sweden are taught from a very young age the correct names of their anatomy, which is what your book was doing, right?
Right. Correct.
So, is there any evidence to show that if children are taught these things at a young age, they end up being more sexually promiscuous or have a higher rate of teenage births or STDs?
Okay. The World Health Organization has statistics by country on sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the onset of sexual behavior and you compare Sweden and the United States, they're about the same age. If you compare unwanted teenage pregnancies and compare Sweden and the United States is significantly higher.
Mm.
If you look at, and that's during teenage years, and if you look at the same thing with sexually transmitted infections, there are many more teenagers getting sexually transmitted infections in the United States than Sweden. And the reason is Swedish young people are taught about condoms. Condoms are readily available and they don't have to even pay for them. And in the United States, we have no sex education.
Mm.
And so, and the lack of sex education, children here don't get their education from their parents. They don't get it in school. So they go on the internet. And when they go on the internet and they put the word sex in, they end up on a adult quote pornographic website.
Right.
And there's a study that says the average American sees porn on the internet between the ages of 10 and 11.
Mm.
And these children are not looking for porn. They're looking for sexual information, and they end up there. And that is their first experience with sexuality. And I think that is really a terrible way to begin your sexual education.
Mm-hmm.
Those films were not made to educate.
Mm.
So,
I agree. And something I've wondered about as well in terms of children not being taught the correct names for their anatomy, I imagine that would make it harder for the child to report sexual abuse as well. If they don't have the correct words to explain it, perhaps they're not able to communicate that. Mm.
Well, that's absolutely correct. I mean, the message we're giving them, I mean, there's no other subject where we don't teach them the correct language.
Mm.
And the message we're giving them is this is a subject we're not supposed to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
And they learn that very well because, most children don't talk about sexuality in an educative way.
Mm. Mm-hmm. So the work you're doing with your films is obviously very important. You mentioned that you got into making films after your PhD. So
I was making them while I was working on my PhD as well.
So how did that begin? What was that process like?
Well, I started out making slide programs, still images with sound. And then we came upon I was in a nightclub and there was an entertainer who was a male and he sang a song by Charles Aznavour called What Makes a Man? And it's about a man who entertains as a woman. And this person came out as a woman, and as the song explains what's going on, he changed back to being a man. And I thought, wow, this was a great song, great visually. Anyway, I asked him if I could make a film of him. And I called the music company, and they said to me, "Is this only going to be used for educational purposes?" And I said, "Yes." And uh, so we made the film. I was at NYU, and I asked permission to use a stage in an auditorium, and I got a crew together. And the name of the film is Gender, and it's 6 minutes long, and it's on SexSmartFilms. So that was my first experience with film.
Mm. And did you know straight away that you wanted to continue making such films?
Yes,
Mm.
yes. It was when I saw the reactions and the discussion. I've learned that films are tools
Mm.
in education. And when I started using the films, one of my mentors at NYU, whose name was Dr. Derek Calderwood, he said, when you use a film, you have to follow the 4 Ps. The first P is you need to preview the film. The second thing is the purpose. You need to tell the group why they're seeing the film.
Mm-hmm.
The third is present it, P, present. And the fourth, which to me is the most important, is processing and having a discussion about what they saw and ask questions. And it gives them an opportunity to ask questions that doesn't have to be their own personal issues. They could refer to the film. And films, I think, are valuable tools when it comes to sexuality training and sex therapy as well. That sex therapists and sex coaches and sex educators are using films to do their work.
Mm-hmm. So what inspires you to make a film? How do you know it's time to make a new one? What's your creative process like?
Well, uh, the I remember, well, I'll give you an example. I did a documentary called Trans that was released in 2012. And I remember Harry Benjamin was an endocrinologist who in 1966 wrote a book called The Transsexual Phenomenon. And before this book came out, if you were transgender and you went to a doctor and told them you were transgender, they would refer you to a psychiatrist.
Mm.
And some of them were committed to mental institutions. Harry Benjamin wrote this book, and it changed all that. And I wanted to do a documentary about Harry Benjamin. And I couldn't get any support. So I decided to do this film. That motivated me to do the film Trans, where I actually talk to trans people and they tell their stories. And that's what this film is about.
Beautiful. And SexSmartFilms has been described as the Netflix of sex education, which is, wow, what a review.
Yes.
What's a film that you suggest everyone listening to this conversation starts with on the website?
Oh, that's a tough. One of them that is very popular is a 4-minute animated film. When I was in Sweden, I saw a book that was written in Denmark, in Danish, called The True Story of How Babies Were Made. And it was translated into English. And I looked at it and I showed it to some children and I saw the reaction. I called the author and I asked him if I could have permission to make it into an animated film. And he 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 gave me permission, and it was, this was probably 15, 20 years ago, and it was very popular. It's still popular. People use it, and I've even heard stories of parents using it when their children ask about how babies are made. They show them this short film.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one I would recommend. There are over 700 films on the website. Some are very, very old, and some are very new. And there are films on education, research, and therapy, and there are films from 52 different countries. So it's interesting seeing the cultural differences when it comes to sexuality. There's one category that I highly recommend people look at. It's called advertising and sexuality, and it's in the section on education. And it has films from 52 countries, and a lot of them are condom commercials. And when you see what's in the commercials in different countries, you see the differences. So, for example, in the United States, you never see a condom in a condom commercial. And I remember I was at a meeting and there was a representative from Trojan, the condom company, and I said to him, "How come you never see a condom in a Trojan commercial?" And he said, "If we put a condom in it, it would never get aired on television in the United States."
Wow.
And you look at, for example, there's a condom brand in Australia called Naked.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a commercial called Get Naked. And you actually see a young couple in the store shopping for condoms. And the woman who's in the store is trying to help them. And they're not sure. And she says, "Well, why don't you try one on?" And they go through this whole thing where you don't see their genitals, but you see their moving like they're having intercourse in the store. And it's done in a very humorous way.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's certain commercials in certain countries where you see nudity. And it's, so, the differences are it's a wide range of differences when it comes to sexuality.
So if you had to put a few countries at the more, open in terms of what they allow in your work and your films, which countries stand out to you? Who are the most liberated countries?
Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, those three are, stand out as, there's one condom commercial from Switzerland. It's called The Bus. And you see a man and a woman standing in a crowded bus looking at each other like they're attracted to each other. And it cuts to them in a bed having intercourse. And then it says, "It's okay to be sexually active. Make sure you use a condom." So it's like a 20-second commercial, but you actually see nudity.
Mm-hmm. I've actually been to festivals in that part of the world, and I was also taken aback by how liberal they are in their sexuality and how open they are, and the lack of shame that I felt in those around me that were exploring their sexuality. And I've always wondered, where that comes from. Do you have some insight into that? Is it
Yeah.
simply because of their education, their sexual education, or is it something
Well,
else going on?
no, I think it is a lot to do with their sex education. I think a lack of sex education breeds shame.
Mm,
And, we're taught this is something we're not supposed to talk about, and it's shameful. And so, where in the countries that have mandatory sexuality education, it's quite the opposite, such as Switzerland.
mm-hmm. Mm.
So,
So which countries would you say are the least liberal in their sexuality when you've made films for them or had them involved in the filmmaking process?
well, I mean, I think the United States,
Mm-hmm.
but there are places in the United States where that's not true. For example, the Kinsey Institute
Mm.
supports my work, and in fact, I donated my film archive to the Kinsey Institute.
Wow.
And so the United States, and I would say there are some African countries that uh, are similar in their attitudes as the United States.
Mm-hmm. That's
So,
interesting, isn't it? Because you wouldn't put those two countries together for such a
no,
thing, especially because America has the value of freedom so strongly held in their culture, and yet it seems like they're not very free in their sexuality. Mm.
no, right.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at attitudes about sexuality, even there are places in the United States that are not allowing abortion anymore.
Mm.
Uh, there are 27 states in the United States that don't allow transgender health care. And this has all happened in the last couple of years.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So
And the
it's
same with
like,
the book banning, right? The book banning has become
yes,
a lot worse. Mm. Mm-hmm.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm.
So the importance of education, I can't tell you how important it is. And I also think that parents should be able to educate, even if it's just providing them with a book when they ask a question,
Mm-hmm.
but letting them know they support. There was a sexuality educator who Dr. Gordon, and he always said, you have to be an askable parent. You
Mm.
have to let your child know that in everyday conversation, let them know that if they have a question, they can come to you.
Mm-hmm.
Because by not identifying genitals with the correct name and never talking about sexuality, you've given the child a message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no message is still a message. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm. Mm. It's very powerful work that you're doing, Mark. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you, Emma.
What has been your biggest learning about sexuality from all of these decades of making these films? If you had to speak to just one biggest learning, what would it be?
Well, I remember when I started off, I thought I was the sexual expert and I knew everything about sexuality there was to know.
Mhm.
And the longer I've been in it, the longer I see there's there's always something new.
Mm.
And, you know, I always think of that saying from Oscar Wilde, you have to be yourself because everyone else is taken.
Mm. Great.
And, there's so many people who have different desires and different what they want might not be what their friend, and you have to learn to be yourself. And I remember once Wardell Pomeroy, who was one of the co-authors of the Kinsey Report, he and I and one other person went out to have dinner, and we were sitting, and the third person used the word promiscuous when we were talking. And Pomeroy said, "Do you know the definition of promiscuous?" And we said, "What?" And he said, "Anyone who's had one more sexual experience than I've had." So, when it comes to sexuality, people are very judgmental. And we judge things based on our own experience.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was working on the transgender project, I would talk to people and would say, "When did you know you were transgender?" And 95% of them said, "When I was a little kid." And I said, what was the indication? And this little boy said, "When my mother took me to the toy store, I wanted dolls, and she wanted me to buy trucks." And that kind of insight.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. I'm always fascinated by how much more there is to learn. And, no matter how many people I talk to, there's always something different to learn from someone about sexuality, or they're into something that I've never heard of before. And it's just so fascinating.
yes, I could not agree with you more.
Mm.
But I laugh at when I was young and in graduate school, I thought I knew it all.
Mm. Well, we always do when we're younger. And I'm glad that curiosity and finding new things doesn't stop. And I've got many more years ahead of me. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh, my pleasure.
You mentioned going out for lunch with people just before, and you've also told me that you once had lunch with William Masters, who, of
Yes.
course, people might know from the TV show. What was it called? Masters of Sex, about him
Yes.
and his research assistant who became his wife. And they were famous because they looked at the sexual response cycle and measured it for the first time, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about William Masters. What do you remember most about that experience, and what was he like as a person?
Well, he was very nice, very easy to talk to. And, a lot of my work, especially the sex therapy films, were based on his research.
Mm.
And what was interesting, I still know a woman who he used surrogates in his research. And she was one of his surrogates. So I mentioned her and told him how important that experience was to her. And he talked about how he had to keep that a secret,
Oh.
because when at first he wasn't keeping it a secret, and then when people were hearing that William Masters was having people have intercourse,
Mm.
So they could view it and do research with them, that was a terrible thing.
Mm-hmm.
So he had, how can you research something and not visualize it? So, and he would talk to the people, the when they were doing research on orgasms, and they were talking about, did you have an orgasm while you were having intercourse? And so all these things were very important to identify and discuss and find out what is going on and how do women bring themselves to orgasm with their partner.
And this was in the 60s, was it? I believe, his research?
Yes.
And you mentioned that you used his research in some of your sex therapy films. Can you give an example of one of these films and its content?
Give me a minute. There's
That's okay.
6 or 7 steps in therapy. Give me a second. And the first film is Sexual Anatomy and Physiology. And, each of these films are like 6-7 minutes long. And they advance. So the second film is like face caress, and they just do, then body caress, then genital caress. And the last film is, and the exercises are called sensate focus exercises. And on SexSmartFilms, we made the same series of 7 sensate focus exercises 3 times. Once for heterosexual couples, once for lesbian couples, and once for gay couples.
Amazing.
So I think the longest film of the 7 is 12 or 13 minutes, and the shortest one is 6 or 7 minutes. But therapists use them. They'll have a session with a client, tell them to go home and watch it together and discuss it. And then when they come back for the next therapy session, they do a follow-up of the content of the film and how did it affect their sexual behavior after they had seen it.
Amazing.
Because it's educating them about sexual response and then encouraging them to follow what the film is saying.
So important. Beautiful. You've also produced a documentary about Betty Dodson, who, of course, was an infamous American sex educator, and she pioneered the pro-sex feminist movement. And she provided such things as workshops and manuals to encourage women to masturbate, often in groups together, which, of course, was revolutionary.
Yes.
What did you learn from her about sexuality?
Well, Betty and I both lived in New York City, and I considered her a friend. And she did a presentation at a conference, and it talked about, she came to New York from Wichita, Kansas, because she was an artist. And she got into sexuality sort of by accident, through her artwork. And she gave this presentation. And okay, I'm back.
Yep.
Sorry.
That's okay.
And she gave this presentation that really was wonderful. And at the end, I went up to her, I said, Betty, that was fantastic. Let's make this presentation into a film. And that's what we did. We sort of redid the presentation at another meeting, and we filmed it, and we put some other things in it, and made it what it is today. So it's one of the films that I'm really proud of, and she was a one-of-a-kind person. I mean, one of the, her favorite vibrator was the Hitachi magic wand.
Uh-huh.
And if you
Powerful.
see the advertisements for the Hitachi magic wand, it's for massage. She called up Hitachi and said, I'd like you to put out one of them with my name on it, and I will promote it and, tell them it's a valuable tool for masturbation.
Mm-hmm.
They totally rejected her request. And today, if you go look for a Hitachi magic wand, it gives you no indication that it's used for masturbation.
It's so interesting that they're still doing it that way because everyone knows.
Yes. And maybe that's why they do it.
So I wanted to bring in a quote from another incredible sex educator that you also knew, Dr. Ruth.
Yes.
She famously said, "Never forget that you have every right to have a satisfying sex life." So it's such a simple sentence, but historically, of course, it's quite radical, and it's still radical today because for centuries, sexuality has been framed through morality, reproduction, or secrecy, all of these things that we're talking about. So do you believe that it is a right to have a satisfying sex life? And
Absolutely.
mhm,
That
it,
I believe it's a right to have a satisfying sex life, and I believe every individual has the right to define what that is, as long as it's consensual.
mhm, mhm,
And consent is a very important topic. But but when it came to Dr. Ruth, I mean, I knew her when she was a teacher at a college in New York City, and she used to use my films when she taught. And I remember one day she told me that she was going to have a radio show on NBC Radio Sunday nights at midnight, and the show would be 15 minutes long. And that was the beginning of her career in broadcast. So, and she had quite a career.
she did. So why do you think giving people permission to pursue sexual satisfaction is still controversial in so many cultures, including our own?
Uh, I think going back to a lack of education, which produces guilt and sex guilt. And I've heard people say we live in a sex negative society. And, I think it's unfortunate that the majority of the country is sex negative. And, the Kinsey Institute, which was created in 1957, 2 years ago, a politician was trying to get them evicted from their home, which is at Indiana University, which is a state university. And they literally tried to get them banned from get them thrown off the campus.
Mm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
here, Kinsey was a scientist, respected scientist, but because his science dealt with sexuality, it became controversial.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what's the way forward? How do we move towards a world that allows more satisfying sex lives and rallies against the censorship that is happening?
Well, I think we need to, my fantasy is that we have sex education in all schools, and it start at an early age, and children learn that sexuality is something they're allowed to talk about, and they're allowed to get information. You know, if a child had a question again about any subject, I can't think of another subject where they wouldn't ask their parent or teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to make it so sexuality is an acceptable subject at home and in school. And I think if we have that kind of education, it will lead to more satisfying sex lives. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I talk to sex therapists all the time, and so many of them tell me the origin of the couple's problem is a lack of information.
Mm.
That's why the first sensate focus exercise, which is called The Guide to Sexual Pleasure, Anatomy and Response, teaches them basic sexual information that they probably never learned as a child.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So I think that being able to get the information and being able to exchange this information with your partner will lead to a more satisfying sex life.
Mm-hmm. And we all want that, right?
Yes.
What's next for you, Mark? What are you currently working on or passionate about at the moment?
Well, there were two things. You know, about 2 years ago, a book came out called "A History of Transgender Medicine in the United States."
Mm-hmm.
And there was one chapter called "The Biology of Gender." And basically, you know, it told people that you didn't one day say, I'm going to be a man or I'm going to be a woman. You're born this way. And uh, we made a script of this chapter, and I wanted to make it into a film. And all the places that usually fund films, when they heard it was about transgender, they didn't want to get involved because of the politics that's going on in the United States today.
Mm-hmm. Mm. So is that a project that you're hoping to crowdsource funding, or you just put it to the side for now?
We put it to the side,
Mm.
and uh, you know, there are a couple of others that, you know, the films start out as maybes, but I did a film uh, recently called Stigma, and
Mm.
it's 3 minutes long, and it's on my website. It's also on YouTube. And if you search on YouTube, Stigma, and then you have to put my name, Mark Schoen, Stigma Mark Schoen, you'll get to it. And it's 3 minutes long. And it starts out with a human heart beating. And then it shows people of different ethnicities, different sexual orientations, different gender identities. And so it shows a wide range of different people. And it ends with a heart beating. And I remember when it first came out, I showed it to a group of college students. And one of them said at the end to me, "So do you discriminate against any people?" And I said, "Yes, I do. I only associate with people who have red blood."
Mm-hmm.
And that's what this film is about.
That's a beautiful message. Beautiful. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss that we haven't spoken about, Mark? Anything else you would like my listeners to hear from your many years of wisdom that might help them with their own explorations of their sexuality or releasing some of the shame they might have around their sexuality?
Well, one thing that is discussed is feature films that you might see on television or in a movie theater. How do they treat sexuality? And there's a wide range. Some are very open and honest, and some are shameful. And I think it's important that we recognize how the public sees, because most of the public don't see films on SexSmartFilms, that their visual sexuality is either pornography, which is not made to educate. And you talk to anyone who produces pornography and ask them, did they made it? They say, one person said to me, they're not made to educate, they're made to titillate. So, but, many people, that's their educational tool. And it's not made for education, and it's not showing, I don't know if I should use the word realistic, but, I remember when I was producing one of the sex therapy films in, I think the late 1990s, I didn't use actors in the film. So I only used real couples. And we were shooting, and the male in the couple said, I have a question. I said, sure. And, there's a big crew there, and he didn't want to ask the question out loud. So he came and pulled me aside, and he whispered, where should I come? And, I thought to myself, where did this young man get his sexual education? And I said to him, when you and your wife make love at home, where do you come? And he looked a little embarrassed, and he said, well, I just come inside her. I said, well, we are looking for sexual realism. I want you to do just what you do at home.
Mm-hmm.
So.
What an interesting life you're living, Mark.
Yeah.
So where can people go to watch your films? I think you mentioned a couple of times, but just to remind people.
SexSmartFilms.com, and you could do, you can watch one film for 99 cents. You could get a 1-month subscription. You could get a 3-month subscription, a 1-year subscription. Therapists get a subscription that they can use themselves, and they can have their clients use their subscription. So, the site is used in lots of academic institutions and lots of clinical institutions. And then people use it independently. They hear about it and they use them themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mark, thank you so much for all of your many decades of hard work and for showing how important sex education is in reducing shame and leading to more satisfying sex lives. It's been such a pleasure talking to you today.
Emma, thank you. You were terrific. You really asked great questions.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm Em, and this has been the Erotic Realm Podcast.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Erotic Realm Podcast. This is an independent podcast. If you want to see more episodes made, you can support it at psychologyofdesire.com by becoming a paid subscriber and entering the realm with many other supporters. The mission of the Erotic Realm is to humanize kink and desire in all of its forms. And we can't do that without you. Until the next time, stay perverted.